Welcome to the Story Atelier, where every tale begins with a whisper and ends with a lesson. Today, we embark on a journey filled with unexpected twists, deep bonds, and moments that test our courage. In a world where silence can often speak louder than words, and where loyalty is sometimes the only thing that keeps us grounded, we meet a man and his dog, a story of trust, protection, and survival. This is the story of James Carter and his loyal German Shepherd, Zeus. It's a tale of moments that define us, and of the bonds that push us to stand strong when the world around us seems uncertain. Stay with us as we explore their journey together, one that will test the limits of trust and loyalty. Will they face the storm together, or will it tear them apart? Let's begin. It was a quiet morning in Glendale, California. The sky, a crisp shade of blue, seemed to stretch on forever, unbroken by a single cloud. The sidewalk outside the local coffee shop was filled with people bustling in and out, each lost in their own thoughts or conversation. It was a peaceful scene, the sort of morning that made you want to savor every moment of stillness. At one of the outdoor tables sat James Carter, a man who had learned to embrace the quiet in his own way. James had been blind since childhood, but the world he navigated was no less rich because of it. He had his routines, his habits, and his ever-present companion, Zeus, his loyal German Shepherd. Zeus wasn't just a guide dog, he was a protector, a confidant, a living testament to the bond that could form between man and dog. James sipped his coffee slowly, the warmth of the cup soothing his senses. He could hear the distant hum of conversations around him, the clink of cups and saucers, the sound of footsteps approaching and retreating. But his focus was on Zeus, whose posture was ever alert, sensing the smallest shift in the air, the faintest change in the environment. Zeus had always been like this, vigilant, unwavering, his training as a former K9 unit still evident in the way he carried himself. James didn't need to see to know that his dog was on high alert, ready to react to any danger that might appear. And on this particular morning, something was about to disrupt the calm in a way neither James nor Zeus could have anticipated. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the tranquility, pulling James' attention away from the comforting hum of the cafe. He could hear the motorcycles approaching, their engines growling louder as they neared. Three figures, clad in leather jackets adorned with patches, dismounted with a certain swagger that James could sense even without seeing. They were a group of bikers, their presence commanding attention with each step they took. James felt a shift in the atmosphere, the air growing heavier, more charged. He could sense Zeus' body stiffen beside him, his muscles taut and ready. The group of bikers approached, their voices loud and boisterous, their laughter cutting through the quiet morning. But James didn't need to see them to know that something was off. It was in the way they moved, in the sharpness of their words, in the way the ground seemed to tremble under their boots. One of the men, the leader of the group, paused as he noticed Zeus. His voice was mocking, yet tinged with something else, curiosity, perhaps, or something darker. "That's a big dog you've got there," he remarked, his tone drawing the attention of his friends. Zeus didn't flinch. He simply stood still, his gaze unyielding as he locked eyes with the man, his body rigid. There was no fear in Zeus, only a silent warning. James could feel the tension in the air as the man leaned in, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "Is he really as smart as he looks?" the man asked, his words dripping with a challenge. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached down, his hand resting gently on Zeus' fur. He could feel the slight tremor in his dog's muscles, a sign that Zeus was on edge, but still under control. It was a look James knew well. Zeus wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, trained to protect James at all costs. The man didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he took a step closer, extending his hand towards Zeus' snout. James could hear the faint growl in Zeus' throat, a low, warning sound that seemed to ripple through the air. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but James knew it well. Zeus was preparing for something. "Easy there, boy," the man said with a dismissive laugh, as if trying to brush off the tension that was mounting in the air. But James could feel it. Zeus was not backing down. The man's friends were laughing now, egging him on, daring him to push further. "What's the matter, Chuck? You gonna let a dog put you in your place?" The words stung with pride, and James could sense the shift in the man's demeanor. Chuck, as the leader was called, stood taller now, as if determined to prove something. He leaned forward once more, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Zeus. James could feel the atmosphere changing, the tension rising. He knew that Zeus was no ordinary dog. This wasn't just about a playful interaction. Something was brewing, and he could feel it in the air. Without warning, Chuck took another step towards Zeus, his hand outstretched. This time, there was no humor in his movements, no feigned curiosity. There was something darker in his eyes, something that James could not ignore. The moment Chuck's hand reached out, Zeus reacted in an instant. He didn't lunge or attack, but his body shifted with incredible speed, placing himself between James and the man. The air was thick with the unspoken challenge. Zeus wasn't going to let anyone come too close to James, not without a fight. Chuck paused, his hand hovering in the air, just inches from Zeus' face. The crowd around them had gone silent, and for the first time, Chuck seemed to hesitate. But then, with a nervous laugh, he stepped back, his pride momentarily bruised. James sensed the shift in the crowd's energy. The onlookers had been watching, some even filming the interaction, and the mood had changed. It was no longer just a casual encounter, it had escalated into something more. Chuck was no longer the confident leader of the group, now. He was a man whose pride had been wounded, and who would do whatever it took to regain control. James could feel the tension radiating from Zeus, his dog's body still poised, ready to defend him at any moment. But there was something else in the air, something that made James' heart race with an uneasy feeling. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence lingered in the air like a thick fog. James could sense it more than he could hear it. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, their collective gaze focused on the standoff between Chuck and Zeus. James didn't need to see to understand what was happening around him. The tension was palpable, and Zeus, his faithful companion, was still on high alert. Chuck, despite his earlier bravado, didn't seem entirely comfortable now. His laughter had faded, replaced by a taut, strained silence. James could hear the subtle shift in Chuck's breathing, a change in his posture as he retreated just a step. But there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. He hadn't been intimidated, not yet. At least, no, this wasn't over. As Chuck stepped back, his friends didn't let up. The playful teasing, the dare, still hung in the air like an invisible challenge. "Come on, Chuck, don't let a dog show you up," one of them shouted, laughing loudly, as if trying to push Chuck into a confrontation he wasn't quite ready for. James could feel the heat of the situation intensifying. His grip on Zeus' leash tightened imperceptibly, a subtle reassurance that he was aware of the growing danger. He spoke softly to his dog, trying to offer comfort, though he knew that words alone wouldn't calm the storm that was building in the air. Zeus, ever loyal, didn't waver. His gaze never left Chuck. The dog's body was coiled, his muscles tense, ready for anything. James knew that Zeus would protect him with his life. But he also knew that sometimes it wasn't just about reacting, it was about waiting for the right moment. For a few seconds, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves on nearby trees. The chatter from the cafe patrons had died down, replaced by a quiet murmuring as they watched the interaction unfold. James could hear the faint rustle of clothing as people shifted nervously in their seats. Everyone knew something was about to happen. Chuck's voice broke the silence again. "You got a good dog there. I'll give you that," he said, his tone more careful now, though still carrying an edge. But he's not the only one with instincts, right? James felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were said. It was like Chuck was trying to convince himself that he could control the situation, that he could push Zeus to back down. But James knew better. Zeus wasn't a dog to be intimidated. And neither was he. Before James could respond, Chuck took another step forward. This time, it was deliberate. His eyes flicked briefly to Zeus, then back to James, a cruel smile curling at the corner of his lips. "Let's see if he's really as tough as you say," Chuck muttered, almost to himself. His words were a dare, a challenge that James could sense more than hear. Zeus growled softly, a low, guttural sound that made James' heart race. It was the kind of growl that carried weight, the kind of growl that made even the most confident person take a step back. James tightened his grip on the leash again. And this time, he didn't speak. There was no need for words. Zeus was saying everything that needed to be said with his posture alone. The moment stretched out, hanging in the air like a taut wire ready to snap. Then, in an almost imperceptible movement, Chuck raised his hand again. This time with no hesitation. His fingers reached out toward Zeus' face. And James could feel the world go still. It was like time slowed. In that instant, James knew something was about to break. And it wasn't going to be good. Zeus reacted faster than anyone could have expected, with a speed that took even James by surprise. The German shepherd surged forward, placing himself directly between James and Chuck, blocking the biker's reach. Zeus' body was tense, his muscles rippling beneath his coat. His eyes, once calm, now burned with an intensity that made Chuck freeze in his tracks. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the cafe. The few who had been filming the situation with their phones quickly lowered them, their faces etched with concern. No one had expected it to escalate this quickly. Chuck's hand froze in midair, just inches from Zeus' snout. For a moment, the two locked eyes, and James could sense the power struggle between them. Chuck's eyes were full of bravado. But there was something else there now, something James recognized as uncertainty. Zeus, for his part, didn't make a move to attack. He didn't need to. His stance alone was enough to make Chuck reconsider his actions. The tension in the air thickened. James could feel it in his bones. There was a simmering rage beneath the surface, waiting to boil over, and Chuck had just poked the hornet's nest. The seconds stretched, stretching into what felt like eternity. Finally, Chuck took a step back, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. All right, he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with disdain. No need to get all worked up. But Zeus wasn't backing down. The dog's gaze never left Chuck, his body still poised for action. James could feel the dog's muscles trembling slightly beneath his touch, a silent warning that the situation wasn't over yet. Chuck laughed awkwardly, the sound hollow and forced. He shot a look at his friends, as if seeking validation, but they weren't laughing anymore. The mood had shifted. What had started as a joke a harmless tease, had turned into something else entirely. And now, it seemed, Chuck realized that he had pushed things too far. The biker leader stepped back, his pride wounded. "It's just a dog," he muttered dismissively, but there was a tension in his voice that couldn't be ignored. "Relax, everyone. We're just messing around." But the damage had already been done. The crowd around them had gone silent. And for the first time, Chuck seemed acutely aware of the attention he was drawing. People were watching, not just with curiosity, but with concern. And even though the man had tried to laugh it off, there was something in his eyes, something dangerous, that made James' skin crawl. Zeus didn't move. His eyes never wavered from Chuck, and neither did James. They were a team, and as long as they stood together, there was nothing that could break them. Finally, Chuck's friends started to laugh again. But it was awkward, forced. The tension was too thick now, and everyone could feel it. Chuck tried to hold on to his bravado, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. The group slowly started to move away, their laughter fading into the background as they left the cafe, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. The morning, which had begun so quietly, was now filled with the remnants of tension, the air heavy with the aftertaste of a confrontation barely avoided. As the group disappeared around the corner, James exhaled slowly, his grip on Zeus' leash still tight. He felt the dog's body shift next to him, the tension slowly melting away. But the unease lingered. There was something about Chuck's behavior, something unsettling that told James this wasn't over. "Good boy," James murmured softly to Zeus, running his fingers through the dog's fur. Zeus responded with a low whine, his body still alert, his ears flicking back and forth. Listening intently, James looked out at the now empty sidewalk. The once bustling scene now eerily quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Something that would test him and Zeus in ways they weren't prepared for. But whatever was coming, James knew one thing for certain: he wasn't facing it alone. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet street as James and Zeus made their way home. The tension from earlier that morning still clung to the air, like an unseen weight pressing down on both man and dog. Zeus walked slightly ahead, his movements cautious and deliberate. James could feel it, the shift in the air, the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The world around him seemed unusually quiet, as if even the city itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds of life, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of people, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, had all faded into the background. All that remained was the soft click of Zeus's paws against the pavement and the steady rhythm of James's footsteps. James had always trusted Zeus to guide him through the world. But today felt different. It wasn't just the morning's encounter with Chuck and his friends, it was something else. A feeling, deep in his gut, that told him the worst was yet to come. As they neared the entrance to his apartment building, James felt a strange sense of foreboding creep over him. Zeus, too, seemed more alert than usual. The dog's ears were perked, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharpness that James couldn't ignore. For a moment, James paused, his hand still on the leash. Something didn't feel right. "Easy, boy," James murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't see the world around him, but he could sense Zeus's heightened state. He trusted the dog's instincts. And if Zeus was on edge, there was a reason for it. The apartment building loomed before them, its familiar silhouette standing against the setting sun. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. As they entered the building's lobby, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. It wasn't the sound of footsteps behind him, there was nothing that obvious. It was a subtle presence, a sense of being watched, like the oppressive weight of eyes on his back. Zeus's growl was so quiet at first that James almost missed it. But it was there, a low rumble that vibrated through the leash and into his hand. It sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. "What is it, Zeus?" James asked, his voice tight. He reached down to stroke the dog's fur. But Zeus didn't seem to relax. His muscles were coiled, his stance alert, his eyes never leaving the door to the outside world. James could hear the faint sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance. It wasn't the usual hum of traffic, this was something closer. Something familiar. His heart rate quickened as he stood there, staring at the door. Zeus's body shifted, his head turning slightly as if to gauge the exact position of the sound. Then, with a deep, resonating bark, Zeus's stance stiffened, his body going rigid as he let out a warning growl. James froze, his hand instinctively gripping the leash tighter. "Zeus, what's wrong?" he whispered, trying to steady his own breathing. The dog's growl had been so sharp, so forceful, that it had sent a wave of fear through James. He knew that Zeus was no longer just reacting to the sound of a motorcycle. He was reacting to something far more immediate, something dangerous. The sound of the motorcycle engine grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the building. The air seemed to thicken with anticipation as the engine roared to life, the noise vibrating through the walls of the lobby. James could hear the rumbling of tires on the pavement, the harsh revving of the engine as it came to a sudden stop. Zeus's growls grew louder, more forceful now. His body was pressed against the door, as if he could sense something, or someone, just beyond it. James took a step back, his mind racing. He could feel the tension in Zeus's body, the way the dog's every muscle was on edge. Without thinking, James pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he dialed 911. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them good. He had no idea who was outside, but he didn't need to see to know that it wasn't good news. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's calm voice came through the line. "There's someone outside my apartment," James said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "I don't know who they are, but my dog, he's reacting. He's growling, and I think something's wrong." The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way and asked for his location. James quickly gave the address, trying to keep his composure. But his heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the seconds stretching out, each one heavier than the last. Zeus's growl was now a constant hum in the background, low and warning. The dog's body was taut, his eyes fixed on the door as if he could see through the walls. James couldn't hear the footsteps outside, but he could feel the shift in the air. The danger was closing in. The sound of a knock on the door shattered the stillness. It was sharp, deliberate, each knock echoing through the hallway, sending a chill down James's spine. Zeus's growl deepened, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the floor. James's grip tightened on the phone, his fingers trembling. "Who is it?" James called out, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a voice. "Hey, it's me, Chuck," the voice called out, the words laced with something James couldn't quite place. Something unsettling. "Relax, man. It's just me. No hard feelings from earlier. Right?" James's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, replaying the events of the morning. Chuck's mocking laughter, his taunting words. It was him. Chuck was back. And from the tone of his voice, this wasn't just a casual visit. Zeus's growl intensified, a warning shot that seemed to reverberate through the apartment. The dog moved to stand in front of James, his body blocking the door. His eyes locked onto the space beyond as if he could see Chuck's every move. James stepped back, his mind reeling. "What do you want?" he called out. His voice tight, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he wasn't about to open the door. Not with Zeus in such a state of heightened alert. Chuck's voice came again, louder this time, tinged with annoyance. "Come on, man. Just open the door. We need to talk. It's not what you think. No harm done, all right?" But James wasn't so sure. He could feel the danger in the air. It wasn't just Chuck's presence that unsettled him, it was the way he was trying to convince James to open the door. He didn't trust it. Zeus's stance grew even more defensive. His muscles rippled beneath his coat. His gaze unwavering. The dog was ready to protect. No matter the cost. James tightened his grip on the leash, knowing that his dog wasn't about to let anyone past that door. Not unless they posed a serious threat. "Leave," James said, his voice cold now, tinged with the certainty that this wasn't a game. "Just leave now. I'm not opening the door." There was a pause on the other side of the door. And for a brief moment, James thought Chuck might actually listen. But then the sound of footsteps shifted. And James heard the unmistakable scrape of something against the wall. It was subtle, but enough to make his blood run cold. Chuck wasn't leaving. He was circling the apartment, trying to find another way in. James's heart raced as he backed away from the door, his hand trembling on the phone. "I need help now," he whispered into the receiver. The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way. But every second felt like an eternity. Zeus was still growling, his body rigid with tension. The dog could sense the danger. And it was only a matter of time before something broke. Then, the scraping stopped. The silence was suffocating. James felt the weight of the moment. Whatever Chuck was planning, it wasn't over. The real threat hadn't even begun to unfold. The silence was deafening. James stood in the center of his apartment, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. The sound of Zeus's growling reverberated through the room. A low, warning rumble that seemed to shake the very walls around him. He could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him. A suffocating pressure that made his chest tighten with every breath he took. The scraping against the window had stopped. But the unease remained, thick and palpable. James's heart was pounding, each beat a constant reminder of the danger that loomed just outside. He couldn't see Chuck, but he could feel his presence. The man wasn't gone. Not yet. Zeus's eyes never left the door. The dog was positioned between James and the world outside, his body tense and ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. James had never seen Zeus like this before, so alert, so keyed up, as if the air itself was charged with danger. It wasn't just the motorcycle or the threat from earlier. No, it was something more, something darker. James's fingers trembled as he held the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He had dialed 911, but the minutes felt like hours. Every second that ticked by felt like another opportunity for Chuck to make his move. The sirens were still distant, far enough that they offered no immediate comfort. And Chuck, well, Chuck was still out there, somewhere. "Zeus, what's happening?" James whispered under his breath. He knew the dog wasn't just reacting to sounds. Zeus was feeling something in the air. Something James couldn't understand, but something he had learned to trust over the years. If Zeus sensed danger, there was a reason, and that reason was enough to send a chill through James's veins. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the apartment door, slow, deliberate, like someone was carefully measuring each step. The noise sent a sharp jolt of fear through James's body. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling of it. The footsteps weren't the hurried, careless steps of someone passing by. They were the calculated steps of someone who was trying to remain unnoticed. Someone who was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Zeus's growling deepened, his body moving to position itself even closer to James, as if to form a wall between him and the door. The hairs on the back of James's neck stood on end. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire apartment was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. James's pulse quickened as he took a step back, the reality of the situation setting in. Chuck wasn't here to apologize. Chuck wasn't here to make amends. James knew that now. The footsteps paused just outside the door. And for a moment, everything went still. James could feel his heartbeat in his throat, the silence hanging heavy in the air. There was no sound from outside, no indication of what was coming next. It was as if time itself had frozen, leaving James in a state of suspended terror. Then, the silence was shattered. A loud, deafening bang rang out from the hallway, a knock on the door, so forceful and deliberate that it rattled the frame. The noise echoed through the apartment like a gunshot, and Zeus's growl turned into a full-throated bark, his body lunging forward as if to protect James with every fiber of his being. The force of the bark seemed to shake the very walls, a warning that left no room for doubt. James's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, his grip on the leash tightening. "Stay calm, Zeus, stay calm," he murmured, though he knew that his words were futile. Zeus wasn't calm, and neither was he. Another knock, this time accompanied by a voice, Chuck's voice, full of mockery and menace. "Come on, man, don't be like this. Let's just talk," Chuck said, his words dripping with arrogance. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just wanted to clear the air." James's skin crawled at the sound of Chuck's voice, the tone so different from the earlier encounter. This wasn't a man who was trying to make peace. This was someone who was testing the limits, trying to push James into a corner. "Leave," James said, his voice steady but tinged with underlying fear. "I don't want anything to do with you. Just go." Chuck's laughter came in response, low and mocking. "You think I'm just going to leave? After what you did this morning?" He paused for a beat, the words hanging in the air like a threat. "No, man. We're not done here." Zeus barked again, his growls now rising in pitch, a clear sign that he was ready for whatever Chuck had planned. The dog's muscles rippled beneath his coat, his body coiled with anticipation. James could feel the tension in the air, the raw energy that Zeus exuded. And for a moment, he wondered if it was enough to protect them from whatever was about to come. But before James could react, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from the door. It was subtle at first, almost like a retreat, but then he realized Chuck was circling the apartment, trying to find another way in. James's heart leapt into his throat. There was no telling how many people were with Chuck, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Chuck wasn't going to stop until he had made his point. And in James's mind, that point was only one thing: to make him feel afraid. The sound of footsteps grew fainter, moving around the perimeter of the apartment. James's grip tightened on the phone. He had to make sure the door stayed shut. He had to make sure that Zeus was ready for whatever came next. And then, just as quickly as the footsteps had begun, they stopped. James held his breath. For a moment, it seemed like Chuck had finally given up, that he had left, but the silence that followed was unsettling. It wasn't the relief that James had hoped for. No, it was the eerie calm before the storm. Zeus's growl returned, this time deeper and more menacing. His body was rigid, his eyes never leaving the door, his ears flicking with every sound in the hallway. James could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Whatever Chuck had planned, it was coming, and James had no idea what it would be. Then, the sound of a low laugh echoed from just beyond the door. It was Chuck's laugh, but this time, there was no hint of humor in it. There was only menace. "Time's up," Chuck said, his voice cold and calculating. And then, the sound of a loud crash rang out. The door to James's apartment was kicked in with a force that sent the frame splintering. Zeus lunged forward, barking fiercely, but James barely had time to react. The apartment had been breached. The real danger had arrived. The door splintered with a loud crack, its hinges giving way under the force of Chuck's kick. The sound reverberated through the apartment, breaking the tense silence like the snap of a rope stretched too tight. James's heart hammered in his chest, the adrenaline surging through his veins as the door swung open, revealing the hallway beyond. Zeus was the first to react. The German shepherd's bark tore through the apartment, sharp and commanding, his body lunging forward with a speed that took James's breath away. He could feel the raw power radiating off the dog, the protective instinct that surged to the forefront. Zeus wasn't just a guide dog anymore. He was a warrior, a guardian who had been trained for moments like this. James's fingers tightened around the leash, his body tensing as he braced for what was to come. He couldn't see Chuck or whoever else was out there, but he didn't need to. He could feel the danger in the air. The room was electric with the threat of violence, the pressure of an impending storm that could break at any moment. "Zeus, stay," James commanded, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. He had to remain calm. He had to trust his dog, trust that Zeus knew what to do. Zeus's eyes locked onto the hallway, his growl a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. The dog was poised and ready, his entire body a coil of tension. He was waiting for the right moment, his instincts razor sharp, and James knew, whatever came next, Zeus was prepared to face it. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. They were coming closer, and James's breath hitched in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, trying to think of a plan. But the only thing he knew for sure was that Chuck wasn't going to stop. He wouldn't leave until he had what he came for. And whatever that was, James wasn't about to let it happen. The footsteps stopped just outside the threshold of the door. And for a moment, everything went quiet. James's mind was spinning, his thoughts a blur. But one thing was clear, he had to protect himself. He had to protect Zeus. And he couldn't let Chuck get any closer. "Leave us alone," James called out, his voice firm, though his heart pounded in his chest. He tried to control the rising panic. But it was difficult. The sense of danger was suffocating. And every inch of the apartment felt like it was closing in around him. The silence stretched, suffocating and thick. And for a moment, James thought Chuck might actually back off. But then, he heard a low, mocking chuckle, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. Chuck wasn't done. He was never going to back down. "You really think I'm just going to leave? After everything that's happened?" Chuck's voice rang out, cold and full of venom. The words slithered into James's ears, each one a twisted reminder of the man's arrogance and cruelty. "You should have known better. You don't get to walk away from this." The doorframe groaned as Chuck's body pushed against it. And James's breath quickened. This wasn't a game anymore. This was real. And in that moment, James realized something. He was completely alone, trapped in his apartment with a man who was willing to do anything to prove his dominance. Zeus's growl deepened, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. His eyes were locked onto the door, his body tense, every muscle in his frame coiled and ready. James could hear the faint sound of Chuck's breathing from the other side, slow, deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. And then, just as suddenly as the tension had mounted, it snapped. Chuck barged through the door, his frame filling the doorway like a shadow. The man was big, his presence imposing, but James wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Zeus had shown him that they weren't helpless. Together, they could handle anything. Zeus lunged forward in a flash, his massive body crashing into Chuck with the force of a freight train. The German shepherd's teeth snapped close, but Chuck managed to sidestep, his leather jacket swinging as he moved out of the way just in time. The two collided with a loud thud, and Chuck let out a grunt of surprise, momentarily thrown off balance. "Get off," Chuck snarled, his voice filled with frustration and anger. He shoved at Zeus with both hands, but the dog didn't budge. Zeus's growl reverberated through the room as he held his ground, refusing to let the intruder get any closer to James. James's heart raced, his grip tightening on the leash as he shouted, "Zeus, down!" It was the command that would stop the dog's attack. But Zeus's protective instinct was too strong. The dog's body was a solid wall of muscle, his stance unwavering. Chuck's face twisted with rage, and he took a step back, clearly rattled by Zeus's strength. But his pride was hurt, and it was clear that he wasn't about to let a dog put him in his place. His hands balled into fists, and he took a swing at Zeus, trying to knock the dog away. Zeus dodged the blow effortlessly, his agility and speed taking over. With a powerful motion, Zeus bit down on Chuck's arm, just enough to send the message. It wasn't a fatal attack, it was a warning. Chuck let out a scream of pain, the sound loud and desperate, and he staggered back, clutching his bleeding arm. The sight of the blood only seemed to fuel his anger further. He looked at Zeus, his eyes narrowed with hatred. And for a moment, James thought Chuck might actually come at them with everything he had. But something changed in the air. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer now, cutting through the tension like a knife. Chuck looked toward the window, his expression shifting from rage to panic. He didn't need to be told twice. With a final, defiant look at James and Zeus, he turned and bolted for the door, disappearing into the hallway before James could react. For a moment, everything was still. James exhaled slowly, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb away. Zeus's body relaxed slightly, though the dog's eyes never left the door, his muscles still tight and ready. James felt the weight of the moment, felt the deep relief wash over him as the reality of their survival settled in. The police arrived moments later, two officers stepping into the apartment, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of the threat that had just unfolded. They took one look at Zeus, who stood proudly by James's side, and nodded in approval. "Your dog saved you," one of the officers said, his voice filled with respect. "We've got a report of a man matching Chuck's description, and we'll catch up with him. You're safe now." James nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Chuck wasn't the kind of man to just walk away, and James knew that as long as he was out there, the threat would always remain. But for now, in this moment, he had his dog, and with Zeus by his side, he knew he could face anything. "Thank you, Zeus," James whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. The dog's tail gave a slow wag, as if acknowledging the unspoken bond they shared. And as the officers left, taking with them the remnants of the storm that had passed through his life, James knew one thing for sure: no matter what came next, he and Zeus would face it together. As we come to the end of this story, there are some profound lessons we can take away, lessons that resonate far beyond the pages of any narrative. Life, much like the journey of James and his loyal dog Zeus, is unpredictable, filled with moments of tension, fear, and uncertainty, but it's also filled with opportunities to stand firm, to show courage, and to rely on the ones we trust. These are the lessons we all need to carry with us, no matter where life takes us. First, we are reminded of the incredible bond that can form between a person and their protector. James and Zeus show us that true companionship is about more than just sharing good times together. It's about being there for each other when it matters most, when things get tough, when danger approaches, and when we need someone by our side to keep us grounded. In life, we all have our Zeus, whether it's a friend, family member, or mentor, someone who watches over us, keeps us safe, and helps us navigate the hardest parts of life. And just as Zeus's instinct to protect James never wavered, we too should trust in the support we have from those around us, knowing that we are not alone. Another important lesson is the power of standing up for yourself, even in the face of adversity. James could have been overwhelmed by fear, could have hesitated, but he didn't. He trusted his instincts, just like Zeus did, and held his ground. Life is full of moments where we are pushed, tested, and challenged, whether by others or by circumstances. But we have the power to stand firm, to speak our truth, and to make sure our boundaries are respected. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean fighting every battle, but knowing when to hold your ground and when to call for help, trusting that the right support will come. Lastly, let's not forget the importance of trust. Trusting in our abilities, our instincts, and in the relationships we have built over time. Just as Zeus trusted his training and his bond with James, we must trust the foundation we've built in our lives. Trust is a powerful force. It gives us the courage to act, to move forward, and to face the unknown with confidence. And even when things seem uncertain, when we can't see the whole picture, it's trust that helps us take that next step. So, as we close this chapter of James and Zeus's story, let's remember, life is unpredictable, but we have the strength to face whatever comes our way. Whether it's leaning on our loved ones, trusting in our own abilities, or simply standing firm in the face of uncertainty, we each have the power to rise to the occasion. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Remember, like James and Zeus, you're never truly alone when you have the courage to trust and protect those who matter most. And sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in what we can see, but in the bond that connects us all.